So thank you all very much for coming. I just wanted to say a few words because obviously many of us, well, all of us have been remembering Greta Fenner this week. And we are here today because of Greta. Now, I had an interesting WhatsApp relationship with Greta, which basically revolved around her sending me messages and saying, Tom, try harder. You know, you're not being grumpy enough on stage. You must do more, which was basically the core of our relationship built up over the 10 years that I knew her since I started the Finance and Security Study program at RUSI. And in true Greta fashion, about 48 hours before the deadline closed for proposing panels for the event, she sent me a message and said, have you proposed a panel yet? No, I said. Why not? I don't know. Well, it's time you and I did a panel together, Tom. We've never done one at IACC together. Now, obviously, sadly and tragically, she is not here to be with us today. We're very grateful to Johanni for joining us today, and obviously our thoughts are with everyone at the Basel Institute. So I just wanted to just take a moment on behalf of us at RUSI and our program just to remember her and basically to, in her absence, thank her for all the support she gave us as somebody who was always very wise counsel to us as a new program that was developing over the last 10 years. So I just wanted to say that, and I'll pass now to Kinga to kick us off.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome, everyone, to our panel on combating modern kleptocracy, assessing the impact of 2 years of sanctions on Russia. This is a panel that will, this is a workshop that will draw on RUSI research, assessing the tools that existed prior and after February 2022, and the work of our distinguished panelists, all of whom have much to share in the field of kleptocracy. The discussion will zoom in on how we can secure advances made since February 2022 in fighting modern kleptocracy. But we also will look into how to ensure the new policies, legislative and operational tools can be effectively deployed to achieve the necessary step change in combating kleptocracy. My name is Kinga Redłowska. I'm the head of Center for Finance and Security at RUSI Europe in Brussels. And with me today is Tom Keating, who is the director of the Center for Finance and Security at RUSI. And today in the morning, LinkedIn just announced today is his 10th anniversary at RUSI. It's also the 10th anniversary of the center he established. With us today is also Bridget Millman, who is the Senior Program Officer at the National Endowment for Democracy. And Bridget, whom I'm sure a lot of you know, has a breadth of experience in working with pro-democratic organizations to tackle kleptocracy and transnational organized corruption across the globe. We are joined also by Heather Maquette, who is the professor of development politics at University of Birmingham, and she also leads the FCDO-funded Serious Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Program, SOC-ACE. Welcome, Heather. Last but not least, we are joined by Johanni Grossman, team leader at the Green Corruption Program, but also senior advisor on Central and Eastern Europe at Basel Institute of Governance. And before joining Basel, Johanni led anti-corruption and good governance programs in Asia and in Ukraine. And in the latter, he worked for more than 5 years to support anti-corruption efforts. Welcome to our panel. Thank you all for joining. We hope this is going to be a very interactive discussion. So first, I will start with a very short round of opening questions and remarks from our panelists. And we hope very quickly we can move to questions that we will take from the audience. So please get ready and prepare questions to grill our panelists. And I will start with Tom. I would like to ask you, Tom, recently you published a paper on lessons learned from the response to Russia's war in Ukraine on combating kleptocracy. Can you please tell us a bit more why you choose to delve into this topic?
Sure. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. You don't realize, but you're actually part of a massive competition at this very moment, because there is another panel about kleptocracy going on with people that we know very well, and so we're competing to see who can attract the most people. So thank you very much for showing your support. I suppose the background to the work we did is that obviously the sanctions regimes against Russia began very much with a focus on freezing finance, oligarchs, and the like. And you know, many of us in this room, many of us in the community here this week have dedicated ourselves to trying to find ways of strengthening the integrity of the financial system against abuse by kleptocrats. And we all get quite depressed about the lack of progress that is being made. At the same time, many governments in the Western world supporting Ukraine's defense through the issuance of sanctions took the opportunity. You know, I often say that the person who did the most for advancing the response to kleptocracy and financial crime, certainly in the UK, the person who's done the most for that in recent years is Vladimir Putin, because many governments took the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia as the impossible issue to ignore when it came to bringing forward legislation that lots of us have campaigned for many years. And so the question, and it was Bridget who thought it would be a good idea for us to look into this, which we were delighted to respond to. The question was, where have we got to over 2 years of sanctions on Russia in this fight against kleptocracy? Because there had been so much focus on oligarchs, and coming from London as I do, the word Londongrad appears, or certainly at one point was appearing on the front page of the newspapers internationally pretty regularly as it sank into people's minds just how much Russian money there was in the UK. And so what we wanted to do was to say, well, how has the implementation of sanctions on Russia affected the efforts that countries are making, provided support to civil society who've been campaigning for responses to kleptocracy for so long. And the short version, I guess, is this. It's not like nothing had been happening as relates to kleptocracy before February 2022, right? I mean, there's been lots of work being done by different governments, but there's no doubt that the momentum that came out of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine provided a moment for us all to harness. But the concern that came out of reviewing what had happened in the past and what was ongoing right now is that looking at this issue, the concern was certainly that looking at the issue was becoming very much a kind of a Russia-focused issue, right? So certainly in the UK, if you looked at the FCDO's website under the leadership at that time, it was a bit like walking into a Wild West bar, because the pictures that they put on their website when an oligarch was sanctioned were like those wanted posters that you see in cowboy films. And the concern that certainly came out of the research we did was that all this resource was going into setting up anti-kleptocracy cells as we have in the UK and other initiatives, but it was focused very much on Russian oligarchs. And as we all know, there are plenty of kleptocrats from other countries around the world that we need to be dealing with. Now, I won't go into kind of obviously all the details of the paper, but I think what we wanted to do with the paper was, first of all, document the progress that's been made and acknowledge the progress that's been made, but then think, how can we take that progress that's been made and move laterally So think about not just the steps that we need to take in order to secure the integrity of the financial system, confiscate assets and so on related to a Russian kleptocracy, but how do we then copy-paste that activity across onto other forms of kleptocracy from different parts of the world. And we kind of document in the report the legislative and the regulatory developments that have occurred since February 2022, and then the operational developments. And I think sitting here now, approximately 6 months after we did the research for the paper, what I would hope is that we can continue the momentum that came out of that initial effort made by governments against Russian kleptocracy, and ensure that it is being applied to all kleptocracy and doesn't, as I fear, end up focusing on this kind of tunnel vision related to Russia.
I'm sure, Tom, you won't get away, and we will get questions from the audience on what do you mean specifically when you say about the kind of progress we've made in terms of operational and legislative, operational capacity and legislative frameworks. But before we do that, I will turn to Bridget. Bridget, you have this immense experience of years working with civil society across the globe, with different stakeholders that on daily basis address kleptocracy and combat kleptocracy. What is your perspective on how the fight against the kleptocracy is going, and what is the NED's ambition?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kinga. And so the National Endowment for Democracy has supported pluralist democracy for over 40 years now, recognizing the importance of diverse representative political parties, competitive private sectors, strong labor unions, and vibrant civil society to consolidate democratic norms and values, to promote accountable and transparent state institutions, and strengthen inclusive and participatory political and civic processes. Our partners around the world have noted how transnational kleptocracy subverts the democratic aspirations and undermines social and economic development gains, fuels conflict, and counters the dignity of the person and the universal human rights agenda. So this is a very real problem that's directly countering the aspirations of numerous frontline and grassroots civic actors around the world to better protect their human rights, hold their governmental institutions to account, and have more opportunities in their own societies. NED has increasingly been recognizing the challenge of kleptocracy as a cross-cutting, cross-regional issue, one that exploits the global financial system, that spans multiple jurisdictions, and creates unique complexities for local civic actors to better respond. And it's in that context that we've seen really, and as Tom noted, particularly since February 24th, 2022, a growing awareness among democratic allies that the challenge that kleptocracy presents to that aspiration. NED recognizes the need for a systemic response to this issue, and for that reason, we have been looking to work very closely with our civil society partners at the country levels in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, the Middle East and North Africa, Europe, and Eurasia, to exchange expertise, develop stronger capacities, and to connect more effectively with groups that may be operating in destination countries that have typically been much more challenging to develop advocacy agendas and engagements with. And for that reason, moving forward, we just hired Zoe Ryder, who I'm substituting for on this panel, but helped to develop a more robust strategy for tackling this thematic area of expertise. Our Forum for Democratic Studies has continued to look at supporting thought leadership and convening, but really with the ethos of the role of local civic actors and how we respond to the challenges this poses, not just to financial development, not just to economic development and competitiveness, but also to the democratic aspirations and the cause of freedom around the world.
And I should have mentioned Zoe couldn't join us today for this panel, but we couldn't have a better substitute for Zoe than Bridget, who has been working with NED and with many of you, probably, of the NED grantees for many years. And I would be really curious to hear on-the-ground experience from some of you on your work and your perspective that is very often supported by NET, and we will have time to turn over to the audience in a second. But before we do that, I want to ask you, Heather, if you can please tell us a bit more about SOC ACE program. Maybe some of participants haven't really heard about the depth of activities that you do within this program and how it has engaged with the topic of kleptocracy specifically and related issues such as asset recovery, because I know that's something you also focus a lot on in your work.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kinga. SOC ACE is a research program that, as you heard, is funded by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. We started as a pilot within the wider ACE, anti-corruption evidence sort of research family, and we have 2 of GIACE in the back there as well. We started in 2021 with a pilot and have now been extended with funding through 2027. It's led by me at the University of Birmingham, but we work right now at this point with over 24 organizations around the world, including RUSI, and we have funded so far 43 projects with just over 100 publications, and you can see a brochure up front if you'd like, and then at the University of Sussex stand along with information about GIACE too. SOC ACE focuses on developing politically informed and more effective approaches for countering organized crime, illicit finance, kleptocracy, and corruption. And one of our overarching themes is transnational threats. And transnational threats covers a whole range of malign actors and practices that often have really devastating consequences, from the local community right up through to geopolitical level as well. In our pilot, we were asked by the then Foreign Secretary to specifically have sanctions and kleptocracy as 2 of the pilot areas that we worked on. And bearing in mind this is 2021, I wasn't convinced. I didn't know why we would have sanctions. I think he was interested in the human rights open societies. But it meant that with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we actually had some good research already underway to help support the policy and practice community out there as well. Not all of our research focuses on kleptocracy. We have a ton of other problems in the world that we look at as well. But some of the projects we do have include sort of RUSI research on moving from freeze to seize when it comes to assets linked to Russian sanctions, but with relevance elsewhere as well, and ways to make sure, innovative ways to think about doing things in a rule of law compliant way, but to allow to achieve some of the objectives. New research on whistleblower protection to incentivize whistleblowers to come forward when it comes to economic crime and kleptocracy. Really exciting new research coming on state threats that includes kleptocracy, but all sorts of other threat areas. It's terrifying and fascinating in its own right as well. We also have worked with RUSI through that on State Threats Task Force as well, which has been a real joy. And we also have research with RUSI on assessing the effectiveness of sanctions to tackle and disrupt organized crime, which may be linked to kleptocracy, but it may not be. But we also have other research that we've done and supported around third-party sanctions evasion and avoidance, on sanctions and smuggling in Eurasia in particular as well, and the way that the sanctions are actually helping to shape and reshape political settlements and economic relationships as well. We're funding research on Russia's use of illicit finance in its foreign policy and in its military objectives, including in its occupation of Ukrainian territory and a lot more. I mean, there is a lot of research underway and out already, but it's aimed at trying not just to boost our understanding, but how to try to help us all think differently and better about bringing that together for more effective approaches as well.
And if you haven't already had the opportunity to read the research that Heather has been leading for SOC ACE, please do make sure to grab the brochure or look for it in the internet. It's easily available, and there's a lot of many interesting evidence-based research papers and reports that I'm sure you will all benefit from. Now turning over to Juhani and Basel, you have also zoomed into kleptocracy in your paper called From Sanctions to Confiscation while upholding the rule of law. What is your perspective on this issue and how this picture developed since your paper was published last year?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and I will do my best to sit in for Greta the best I can. Tom, you were mentioning messages urging you to do more. Imagine being directly managed by Greta full time. Yeah. So obviously it's a legacy that we try to uphold as best as we can. So first of all, thank you very much for bringing this topic and merging these themes together, because one of the challenges, of course, in this space is the mixture of the tools and the moral imperatives that we're trying to achieve. I was reflecting. You were mentioning that the NED's work over 40 years in this space, and I was remembering a workshop that I was at. And I'm dating myself here, but bear with me for a minute. In Nizhny Novgorod, as part of the NED family in 2002, when that sort of conversation was still possible in Russia, and where we were working and discussing how to hold Russian kleptocrats sitting in the Kremlin accountable. Obviously, we did a fantastic job with this, and now we're all paying the consequences for it. And so with this realization that we've tried to address this for a long time with different tools, pulling out additional tools such as sanctions to address this is a really interesting experiment. And I think everybody will agree it's not wholly satisfactory so far. And in the paper that Kinga mentioned kindly, the point we're trying to make is that the purpose of sanctions and what sanctions are being discussed about are quite different. The question about coercing a change in behavior, as sanctions are originally designed for, and the fact that now we're talking about them as used to confiscate assets, is quite problematic on a range of efforts, on a range of levels, least of all the fact that we don't seem to be managed to do it so far, but also because we are, of course, all realizing that we are, in fact, achieving very little change in behavior as part of the Russia-oriented sanctions, and so trying to move on to other things like confiscating the assets. And to be clear, of course, this is a question that is a moral imperative. You know, these assets, among many other assets, should be going to Ukraine. And the question is how to do that without undermining rule of law, how to do that without undermining what Ukraine is fighting for, in fact. And so our paper focuses on challenges in this process, in these approaches, where there are limited opportunities to use existing judicial efforts and safeguards, where the distinction between political process and legal processes, of course. And we try to highlight the fact that there are, in fact, other things in addition to the very narrow, highly politicized debates on the sanctioned Russian assets and getting them to Ukraine that we should be doing. And to me, this reminds me of the conversation where we in the West like to say, all hands on deck, we're doing everything we can, but there are many other things we can be doing in addition to this. And so we highlight a few options related to asset recovery tools, that could be closely related. You asked what has changed since the paper was written. Obviously, there is some good progress. I wish there was more, but there's some good progress in relation to sanction evasion, criminalizing that with the EU directive. We have the first money going to Ukraine, right? Konstantin Malafeyev's 5 million, not as much as we would like, but a particularly unpleasant character, so there's some moral satisfaction in that. And we also highlight other tools such as conviction-based forfeiture, non-conviction-based forfeiture, and illicit enrichment, which all have their own challenges, but also opportunities that should be utilized more, both in regards to Russian assets, but let's not forget that there are also quite a lot of Ukrainian assets that have been frozen for a long time that really should have gone back to Ukraine a long time ago. Thank you.
I do encourage you to take a look at Juhani's paper, and during this discussion, we keep encouraging you to look at the research and papers that all of us produce. I hope that at least every attendee will leave with at least one good research paper that you will read on your way back home. And before I will turn to Tom for another round of questions, the last one, because then we will open the floor and we'll take questions from the audience, I will maybe ask to put on the slide with the QR codes to two of our research, CFS research, because I will ask Tom now about the second paper you produced in cooperation with OCCRP. RUSI teamed up with investigative journalists to analyze more than 100 cases of sanctions circumvention. So I wonder, how did this add to the assessment of the international community's response to modern kleptocracy? And in the meantime, please feel free to scan the codes and download our reports.
Yeah, I thought everyone was taking a picture of me, but of course you're scanning the codes. So I'm going to answer your question, Kinga, as I always do, but I wanted to pick up on something that Juhani said as a segue into that, which is, I think, one of the things that was very clear to us when we were doing the first paper that we talked about, is that there were many policymakers who thought that kind of sanctions were one and done, right? We've sanctioned the oligarchs. We've done our bit. And of course, that's just the beginning of any process. Thinking that sanctioning and freezing someone's assets is somehow all that needs to be done is a kind of failure of vision and a failure of commitment as well, because of course sanctioning somebody requires, and with all due respect to organizations or government departments to do this, it requires a bit of research. We've all seen the kind of research that sanctions designations are based on. It requires a bit of research. It requires a signature from a minister, and it requires someone to press upload on the internet. I mean, that's basically what it boils down to. That's nothing compared to the work that obviously needs to be done in order to investigate, to prove to an appropriate standard that assets can be confiscated. So I think one of the things that Juhani, you mentioned the kind of 5.4 million that the Americans have managed to gather, and you know, it kind of worries me that if the United States, with all its experience, has only managed to get to a number of 5.4 million so far, we have a lot of work to do if we want to genuinely say that we are responding to modern kleptocracy in a way that then returns assets to the states from which they have been taken. And so in thinking about, well, what more should we do, one of the recommendations we made in the paper was about dismantling enabling architecture. So that includes obviously bringing transparency to beneficial ownership registries and all the sort of the tools of the trade that those that structure schemes for kleptocrats can use, but also shining a light on those that do all that structuring and are known in the jargon as enablers. And so we had an opportunity to work with OCCRP to look at all their reporting on sanctions circumvention, and as Kinga says, between OCCRP and some partners of OCCRP, that was about 100 stories, and basically pull out of those stories what are the typologies, again to use the jargon, of enabling activity that we're talking about. So a colleague of of mine, Eliza Lockhart, produced this enormous spreadsheet which went through all the stories down one side and then bit by bit plotted what are the different typologies. And we ended up with about 12 different typologies. This is the paper here, Disabling the Enablers of Sanctions Circumvention. And what that kind of showed us was that there are some very consistent tools and measures used by enablers who offer these services to kleptocrats and others that are trying to evade sanctions or just more generally get their money somewhere where they feel it can be safe. And you know, there's nothing new per se. I don't want to talk down our work. There's nothing new per se in this. But I think one of the things that we were trying to encourage the policymakers that we then engaged with on the report to think about was you can run after Mr. X or Ms. Y, who's a lawyer or a trust and company service provider, but actually what we want to do is we need to take the tools off the table that these people can use. So whether it's making it more difficult to hide wealth, whether it's more difficult to transfer control between family members to avoid sanctions, all these different tools, they're on the table and can be used by bad actors or just people who are happy to be paid to be helpful to kleptocrats. And so I think this was kind of what came out of that bit of work, and we kind of hope that people will absorb that. And yes, of course, it's great to see stories from OCCRP and others naming and shaming individuals, but it's also great to see policymakers dive into the underlying systemic issues that needs to be fixed. And what we've tried to do with this work is to kind of act as a bridge between the storytelling on the one hand and the key issue that matters for policymakers. Because I think too often we find, I sat in a great session yesterday organized by Ned, which was presentations from people who are doing really fantastic work with kind of data on trade flows and all that kind of stuff. The question that one of the analysts that presented this asked is, but you know, how do we get this engagement into policymakers? How do we actually get policymakers to take what we've done seriously? Well, the simple answer is make sure you understand what policymakers are interested in taking seriously, and present this work in a way that lights their fire. And so that's what we've kind of tried to do with this report, and hopefully we can see some movement forward on this very specific area of enablers, which, you know, I think we all recognize continues to be a festering sore in any attempt to control kleptocracy.
Thanks, Tom. We will we'll again take some questions from the audience very soon. Before I will turn to Bridget. When you go to Ned's website and the kleptocracy section, you can read kleptocracy is about much more than illicit financial flows. Bridget, can you elaborate on this?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kinga. So, as I mentioned, since we're recognizing, I think Juhani put it very well, the moral imperative of taking action on the all too human consequences of these kleptocratic systems that often fuel violent conflict, but also rely on extraction, frequently of natural resources, be that gold, oil, gas, timber, other resources, the looting of public assets in global majority countries, the laundering of those funds through the global financial system, and the storing in destination countries, frequently in Western Europe or North America, looking at real estate, luxury goods, or other investments. And so recognizing that this is truly a highly systemic type of corruption that relies on a networked global financial system begs the recognition that networked corruption requires a networked response. And for that reason, it's vital to move beyond simply the efforts to investigate particular incidents, but look at where are the levers to harness a more effective systemic response to this, recognizing that these extracted assets rely on a kleptocratic supply chain, looking at evading sanctions, eluding export controls, misinvoicing trade, and otherwise trying to evade the efforts to have any sort of integrity in the global financial system or to exploit loopholes. And so our partners have really noted the importance of unwinding that system through investigating and advocating for more effective policies. Certainly, as Tom mentioned, it is quite critical to ensure that there is a networked and community space so that groups can understand what is of interest to policymakers, often in destination countries, what is necessary in order to have this sort of accountability or return of assets, but also increasingly focusing on the sources of kleptocratic wealth generation and the human consequences in the origin countries. So again, as Juhani noted, we really do recognize it as a moral imperative and as something that's fundamentally undermining the level of development investments and the efforts to strengthen the consolidation of democratic norms and values in countries around the world. So we view it as far more than simply a particular illicit financial flow, but the need to really develop a truly systemic response that harnesses the energies and the expertise of diverse civic movements in generating a more effective system.
And you do that by supporting the work on the ground, supporting grassroots. SOCACE supports research. So for the research that you oversee on kleptocracy, tell us about how these efforts related to kind of producing and disseminating research support combating modern kleptocracy.
Great, thank you. So SOCACE's research is guided by some principles that actually guide the wider ACE program, and I'm just going to pick out 2 or 3 here. Anybody who's here who works on and has worked on governance or anti-corruption programming for the past few years will probably recognize some of these as well, because they're basically thinking and working politically, adaptive management, agile ways of working, or so on. And I want to point out that SOCACE is funded, as I said, by FCDO. And so we've worked really hard to try to make sure that the research is relevant and useful to people working in foreign policy and development policy. But we work really closely with colleagues elsewhere in law enforcement and intelligence and the military and the private sector, so on to try to cut across. And that is thanks to people, including some people in this room who I won't point out, but they know they're very thanked, that I think it is relevant beyond the research community as well there. I want to start. Firstly, the research is very much about avoiding being solutions-led. So looking at being problem-driven. What is the actual problem as the starting point, not the solution or the tactic or the intervention that you might do? The research on sanctions actually goes against the grain for a lot of the research because it is a solution. You're starting with a tactic and then doing the research on that tactic as well. Often sanctions have been deployed without a clear understanding or articulation of what the actual problem is that they're supposed to be addressing as well. And so we really hope that the research helps us to better understand those problems as well as how to make those tactics more effective as well. Other parts of the research help us to sort of flesh out and understand some of the unintended but surely not unanticipated consequences of sanctions as well, and especially rolling out so many sanctions at such pace and such scale in a short period of time without a clear strategy or set of objectives to be working towards as well. And that includes absolutely huge increases in smuggling, as the research and other investigative journalist reports and so on have shown, a lot of which involves legal entities and not organized crime, as some of the research actually originally anticipated as well as sort of really fueling innovation and sanctions evasion techniques too. So the second insight coming out of this that builds on this is actually a lot of the research highlights the ways in which sanctions are actually really helping to shape and reshape political dynamics within Russia, within its neighbors, and with sort of third countries and around the world. but it also shows how important economics is as well. For example, the research on third country sanctions evasion and avoidance, one of the hypotheses going in is that political relationships and geopolitical relationships would explain why some jurisdictions are engaging in sanctions evasion and avoidance. It's not. It's economics is the primary thing, and it is not the state and state-to-state relations. It's the private sector and profit, basically, that is driving a lot of that as well. Thirdly, the research highlights the need for there to be much better sort of understanding about tackling kleptocracy more broadly in a strategic way, in which sanctions may have a role to play as part of that wider strategic role. But right now it can often feel like sanctions is the only tool in the strategic toolbox that's being deployed sometimes. And that's not true, obviously, and I'm sort of exaggerating a little bit, but it does feel like sanctions is the first go-to there. My worry is that sanctions then becomes almost like a form of penicillin, where it starts to breed antibody resistance within the system as more and more entities, jurisdictions, nations, or so on step up to avoid sanctions, because it starts to affect more and more countries and bodies, or so on. So you have a problem with human rights, sanctions. A problem with corruption, sanctions. A problem with organized crime, more sanctions. The real risk there, beyond a potential complete rewriting of the international system and so on, is that you end up losing sanctions as an effective tool, because they are effective and they have a role to play within that toolbox as well. A colleague and I are writing a paper right now, and I'm sort of hesitant to say this because it's really early stages, but we're looking at sort of the literature around policy suicide. So when actually things become so discredited that they actually kill off an area of policy, even though it might still be good. And there is a risk there that I can see. There's some solutions-led approaches in other ways, militarized approaches to tackling organized crime, for example, or anti-corruption or counter-organized crime messaging campaigns that tend to be politically popular, and they tend to be really popular with public audiences because they're simple. They sound simple. They're easy to announce. They are muscular. They do something that people understand and they want to see, but they can have catastrophic consequences if they're rolled out without a really clear strategy, without thinking about the political analysis and the consequences as well, without integrated working and multi-agency working that brings together those different viewpoints and equities and so on. And we have research in the program on, separate to sanctions, but looking at strategies and integrated working and multi-agency, improvements to multi-agency working that we hope also applies to sanctions going forward. Because the consequences of what we're seeing, and colleagues have talked about this, are absolutely huge. So we want to make sure that the tools that we have and the solutions that we have are going to be effective and don't have those consequences. And we really hope that the research is contributing to that in some way.
Last question from me to you, Hani, and then we will turn for your questions, comments, and insights. I will refer again back to your recent paper. What is holding countries back from making progress against kleptocracy, in your opinion? And can you point us to any best practices from your research at Basel and your research of your colleagues that other countries should learn from?
Thank you. Yeah. Trying to reflect on what are the tools that we have to fight kleptocracy, trying to reflect on the lessons learned over the last 2 years. I think one of the clear takeaways is the limits of sanctions. I won't go into the decline of the West and its role in the financial sector and things like that, but those are definitely very real things to consider in terms of what we are likely to achieve, even under the original goal of sanctions, never mind about the restated goal of sanctions. I think the other issue is that we as societies haven't quite realized how serious kleptocracy is and what we need to do to mobilize against it. And I'm saying this as somebody who lives in Finland, a country with a 1,300 kilometer border with Russia, so it is quite serious for us. But much more important than that, our central hockey arena in Helsinki is owned by sanctioned individuals and has been frozen. and you'd think that's a good thing for a hockey arena to be frozen, but it is in fact what really drives the point home that sanctions are serious business. This pain that we are experiencing, not having access to our central hockey arena, is of course nothing in comparison to the pain that the sanctions are supposed to inflict. And this disproportionality that we're trying to work with, you know, I'm sure you've seen the studies, $1 that we are suffering is $11, or 1 GDP point on our side is 11 GDP points on Russia's side. All these things, they're of course true, but that requires us to make more sacrifices, and I think what we are doing so far is really not sufficient. And that, for us as an anti-corruption community, I think it also forces us to reconsider our approaches, our way of thinking, and again, the war in Ukraine has a way of crystallizing that. We need to, I would argue that the best way we can fight kleptocracy is to help Ukraine with whatever it needs, and that includes us as an anti-corruption community to make very unusual choices, right? How do we ensure that that Ukraine remains a well-functioning state that delivers for its citizens in contrast to its northern neighbor? We have to look at areas like the defense sector, corruption in the defense sector, how to mitigate corruption risks in defense manufacturing, something that many of us, I think, are reluctant to do because we're from this sort of pro-peace world historically. But these are very real issues to look at. And of course, it also includes sometimes going outside the narrow anti-corruption space and advocating for things such as air defense systems. I would argue that they have become a key part of the anti-kleptocracy toolbox if we want Ukraine to maintain a functioning state. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we will take questions. If there's anything that you agree, disagree with, or would like to comment, now it's the time to start this. I will take 2-3 questions. We will have rounds, and please introduce yourself. And if the question is to be addressed by a specific panelist or it's general, please share all this information. So we have 2 questions: the gentleman in the first row and gentleman here. Let's start with the gentleman in the 4th row, because the mic is there.
Thank you, yes. My name's Mark Temple. I'm Attorney General for Jersey. It's a question for the panel in general, but perhaps for Juhani in particular, given his problem with the frozen Finnish ice hockey rink. It's a question in relation to what to do with sanctioned assets. And what does the panel think of civil forfeiture as a tool to forfeit those assets? It obviously requires a lot of individual cases to do it, but at least it gives the opportunity for the person whose assets have been sanctioned to go through a lawful process and if at the end of it, and perhaps put the burden on the person to prove that those assets have a legitimate source. What does the panel think of that as a means of unlocking sanctioned assets and perhaps eventually allowing those assets to be used for Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have one more question here.
Hello, my name is Ilya Shumanov. I'm Director of Transparency International Russia. My question to Tom, maybe to other colleagues. Now we are seeing that Russian oligarchs, they are using crypto as a main tool for maybe saving their money, to transfer their money abroad. And last year we issued a report from Moscow with crypto, and this report showed us that it needs 2 hours to transfer the bag of cash, unknown sources, to a door in London. Any door deliver without any problem. And it looks like that every Russian oligarch has its own crypto projects, mining projects, crypto assets, even sometimes mixers and other crypto. Yeah, my question, I have tried to count, nobody of you mentioned crypto. You're talking about the modern kleptocracy and not mentioning crypto, I suppose, very strange, and especially in the capital of crypto in Vilnius. What's your point? Where the combating modern kleptocracy? Is it tied with crypto, or are you thinking that we still need to thinking like an old-fashioned way, trying to detect money through the traditional ways like banks, like supply chains and other things? Thanks.
Thank you. Juhani, over to you with the question about civil forfeiture, and then to Tom on crypto. And please, Bridget and Heather, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, my answer is going to be very short. I think it's a fantastic approach. Our paper discusses some civil forfeiture approaches. Of course, Jersey has had very significant success in regard to that, in regards to other jurisdictions, kleptocrats there. So we would certainly encourage building on those tools. Every country's legal configuration is slightly different, so there's no one-size-fits-all. But as we try to stress in our paper, there are ways that ensure due process, ensure that the assets are returned, but are returned in a way that is legally defensible and will stand up in courts. I mean, it would be really a shame if we seize assets, sent them to Ukraine, and then we lose in court somewhere, and we have to return them. Aside from the fact that the money would be gone, but also the reputational challenge there, I think, would be quite crushing. So, big fan of that idea. Thank you, Mark, for mentioning it.
Maybe just pardon me, a brief word on that. I'm not one for ripping up the rule of law, but I am equally one for evolving. And it strikes me that there hasn't been a lot of evolution in how we think about this topic from a legal perspective. The idea I have in mind, you'll be very familiar with, is the sort of somewhat abortive attempt to introduce unexplained wealth orders in the UK, which were designed precisely because it is difficult to get evidence from country XYZ if you're trying to prosecute one of these cases. And I think I wouldn't want to go as far as some countries have been talking about going, we don't like you, we're going to take assets off you. I mean, that clearly is not appropriate. But I don't think we've been smart enough in deploying our legal minds to sort of try and identify these step forwards. And where we have done them, as with unexplained wealth orders in the UK, they haven't proved to be perhaps the solution that everybody hoped. So again, I kind of would hope that the light that has been shone on this topic will encourage countries to look at the legal tools they have and say, are they really fit for the challenge that we're facing? Because I think the reality is that they are not. On the crypto point, so we had a workshop recently in Brussels where we talked about crypto as the kind of a circumvention tool, and I sometimes wonder, and I'll be more than happy to debate this with you. I sometimes wonder whether crypto, we should mention crypto, I'm not going to dispute that, but is crypto actually the core tool that is being used by kleptocrats? We clearly should be holding exchanges accountable. We clearly, as the US have done, have proposed designating mixers as primary money laundering concerns. There are massive vulnerabilities in that system. The thing that worries me most about crypto right now is actually the extent to which mining is being done in kind of energy cheap jurisdictions like, say, Transnistria, and where those newly minted coins are basically being used as new skins to pay for Russian military procurement outside Russia. Because anyone who knows anything about the crypto industry will know that a newly minted coin is exactly that. It has no history, and so of course it's difficult to spot that it is involved in illicit activity. So I don't dispute the role that crypto plays. I just wonder whether is it the big bogeyman that some people suggest it is. It's definitely on the list, but where on that list is it? I don't know. But I'd be more than happy to talk more about that with you. I'd welcome that, actually.
Heather.
Just to add to what Tom said, I mean, you hear similar discussions being held when it comes to organized crime in general, and the thing that sort of sticks with me is that people they're business people, they're looking to invest. It's a very unstable form of investment, so as a way to move money around, yes, but not as a way to hide in perpetuity, because you want stability for your family, you want to pay for school fees and all of that kind of stuff, which I think I agree with Tom that it's more what crypto allows people to do that is more difficult to do now through other means. That's actually the outcome of those activities more than the crypto itself. And to me, that's why crypto is important, not necessarily just because of it as a tool to move things around. And I think, John, your point about the hockey rink, I mean, it really drives home how sanctions are sometimes put out there as almost a pain-free response for us, as a weapon of war, without actually, risking loss of life to soldiers or whatever. It's a sort of politically acceptable sometimes, but they do hurt, and they hurt in the sanctioning country as well. And the assets that are seized, they might be assets that have consequences for communities too. And I think that's been lost from the discussion sometimes.
As if you want to join Kinga's book club, because I'm really into promoting reading today, a bit off topic, but on the crypto topic, please watch out for the upcoming research by our colleague Oksana Ichnatenko, who is here with us, who delves into crypto and Ukraine. She's looking what sort of opportunities and challenges crypto and virtual assets will bring to Ukrainian financial integrity and for Ukraine more broadly. But that's off topic and more on Kinga's book club. But now I will take another round of questions. We have questions from a lady in the first row and in the lady in the third row and from Egle. And then we'll have another round, I promise. This is a female round, ladies only.
Hi, my name is Leonie Kiewski. I'm an investigative journalist in Brussels. I've been reporting quite a lot on sanctions, so I'm quite happy to listen to you. So 2 short questions on the EU specifically. One is on the evidence packs against the oligarchs, because initially at least the quality was quite poor from what I've seen. I wonder whether you have a view on whether they've improved since the war started in terms of what evidence is presented to sanction oligarchs. And then the second one is that the EU proposed an anti-corruption sanctions regime, or the Commission did, and I wonder whether you think that's efficient. Maybe that's a question for Heather, given that you seem a bit skeptical about introducing more sanctioned regimes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Emily Patterson from State Capture Research and Action. There was a mention of an increase in smuggling being correlated with an increase in sanctions, and I'm wondering if anyone has any insights into potential increase in corruption connected to an increase in the use of sanctions. Thanks.
And Egle?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Egle Lukashiene. I'm from AML Center here in Lithuania. And here in Baltic states, we know very well how Russians were successful on exporting corruption and kleptocracy. And I wonder, do you have any insights or maybe data how Ukraine itself is combating with this awful legacy of Russian influence? So just if you have any thoughts on that, it would be interesting to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. So maybe we'll start with Tom and the question about oligarchs. I'm sure I already know what you will say, but let's listen to that. Then I will turn over to Heather also about the EU anti-corruption regime. We have a question from Emily. I think Tom, maybe you will take it, and Juhani, you will be best place to respond on Ukraine and corruption. So, Tom, let's start with you.
Well, the evidence packs seem to be working, right? There's been plenty of challenges to the evidence that has led to oligarchs being sanctioned. They seem to be holding firm. I mean, I've probably seen the same ones as you, and I'm amazed they're holding firm. But they are holding firm. I think one has to recognise that many of the decisions that were made on sanctions initially were focused on oligarchs, and they were made late at night on a Sunday in a panic, and all the rest of it. So I'm sure they are improving, but they're holding firm. At the moment, there've been obviously some have been overturned, but fundamentally they're holding firm. So from my perspective, they're probably working, and the newer ones are definitely far more researched because they're in a way more complicated and more difficult. I think sanctioning Viktor Vekselberg or a Rottenberg or Abramovich, was pretty straightforward because there was the political desire to do that. Some of the more recent ones have been, I suppose, more technical in their approach because they've been individuals who are involved in specific activities rather than just being obnoxiously wealthy, and therefore those have required more detail. Kinga.
Heather, do you want to pick up on anti-corruption regimes and?
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to come out with a very strong yes or no, definitely. But the things that I think about with the anti-corruption regime is, again, it's that tool. So what is the tool going to do that's going to allow us to do something that we can't do in other sorts of ways, and where it's the best tool for that? I constantly think about unintended consequences as well. So where do you even begin? So who are you going to select? Because there is a lot of corruption in the world, so how do you do that? You think about, how do you stop abuse of that? I mean, all you need to do is to task, to leak some information about people to investigative journalists who in good faith publish it, and then you can have your political opponents or rivals. There's a lot of potential abuse there. We have as far as I know, there isn't really clear evidence on effectiveness. I worry about a distraction from other things that are working and that are important, including things like beneficial ownership and transparency, focusing more on trusts. And there's so many different things going on. Colleagues, and this is where I'm going to do too much reading of this kind of stuff. I can't remember if it's a GIACE or SACACE project, but colleagues had looked at how also in countries where corruption is pretty rife, the politically powerful can change the laws to fit them. I think it's actually both on both sides. So actually, you might miss some of the most pernicious forms because people just make it legal, because there aren't international standards in terms of or laws there. And I just think there's so many questions to me. It's just not really clear why we would use them and if the use would actually offset some of the quite clear challenges there. It doesn't mean that they might not be effective, but I would want to see a lot more. Very concerned about talk about an anti-corruption court, which I think is a poor idea and a bad idea for similar sorts of reasons as well, and would be a huge distraction. Can I just say something about the sanctions? I have a meme. There's a TV show in the UK about a police corruption agency, and I have a fantastic little meme from one of the advertisers that said, "Corruption depends on bent coppers," which is a weird British way of saying corrupt police officers. And so basically, if there's sanctions will always lead to smuggling. I mean, we have sort of wonderful myths about World War II and, women drawing lines in the back of their leg because they couldn't get stockings. So they got stockings. They got them from black market dealers and so on. So we know that that's going to be the case. Smuggling will increase corruption at borders. I mean, there's so many different ways that it will. To me, the corruption is not the most worrying part of that in the short term, but it could become if more and more people who are otherwise law-abiding feel compelled to engage in sanctions evasion or so, and it could have much more pernicious effects in the longer term if it starts to break down norms around integrity and things like that. So.
Tom, do you want to add?
Just on the anti-corruption sanctions regimes point, the question that I would be asking as a journalist of anybody who is talking about sanctions is, what are you trying to achieve with those sanctions? to summarize what Heather was saying. And I suppose my concern is that the success of the use of sanctions is judged quantitatively. In other words, how many anti-corruption sanctions have you issued? 20. Is that good? Is that not enough? Should there be more? So I think frankly, I think it's a cop-out. They can be a cop-out for actually taking the action that's really needed. And just turning back to the question of kleptocracy, if we're going to use anti-corruption sanctions against people that we believe are kleptocrats, then that achieves nothing at all for the country from which the money was stolen, right? What achieves something for the country the money was stolen from is the kind of stuff that Mark was asking about with regards to taking legal action. And the one thing on the smuggling and corruption, at the moment there are so many legal loopholes in the Russia sanctions regime that I don't think you need to be doing illegal smuggling or corruption. You just structure your procurement through one of the massive gaps through Belarus or whatever it might be. But inevitably there will be opportunities for corruption. But at the moment, the most effective anti-corruption tool against Russia sanctions is the inadequacy of the regime.
So can I just... Sorry, I mean, other things too, the cost of sanctions, and, if anybody here is working in law enforcement, there is nowhere near enough resource going into investigation and law enforcement, I mean, wherever you're sitting within this kind of chain. So the more sanctions we have, the more already overstretched sources are going to be, so we need to think of that. I also think, I mean, you can see it with all sorts of stuff right now, but there are real potential for double standards. So are we going to see a U.S. president or a British prime minister or a German chancellor or so on being sanctioned for corruption if there's an investigation or so on? That is where you would see that this is a significant tool with real teeth. If it is just used against the sort of usual suspects in a way, that becomes sort of problematic in all sorts of ways, including fueling anti-Western narratives about double standards and so on. So I could go on about unintended consequences in the sort of way. But.
So, Johanni, what's happening in Ukraine in terms of corruption and anti-corruption efforts?
All right. Thank you for that question, Egla. That's certainly an ongoing issue because, as you rightly pointed out, there is a cleansing process that needs to take place, right? I mean, you have experience with this in Lithuania as well, and many of us, frankly, in the West also do. And this cleansing process, it's for me quite amazing when I go to Ukraine and I work with the anti-corruption agencies to see how thorough they are in this efforts of cleansing. And you'd think a country at war would not really prioritize anti-corruption efforts, but in the 20 years that I've worked with Ukraine, I've rarely seen them as active in this space. We published a paper last week, by the way, that sort of summarizes recent achievements together with TI Ukraine. You can see it on our website. And so these cleansing efforts are exemplified through the very robust anti-corruption architecture. Again, one that many Western countries, I think, could dream to emulate. Independent enforcement, independent prevention, independent prosecution, independent judiciary, all focused on corruption, selected through a body of international experts. It is quite remarkable. And what we're seeing now in this wartime is the resilience of this anti-corruption infrastructure, which is in itself remarkable, frankly. We see that the Ukrainian state keeps investing in it, and they're making very difficult fiscal decisions right now. So to keep investing in more anti-corruption detectives, you were talking about insufficient resources for law enforcement, is a big deal. But we're also seeing that these anti-corruption institutions are going through renewal processes during wartime as the old leaders are retiring, new leaders are coming in, and the agencies continue to operate quite effectively. But most importantly, and maybe emulating Heather's point a little bit, most importantly, we're starting to see wartime-related corruption investigations and prosecutions that are politically painful. This is really the sign that the system is working, right? Members of parliament, government officials, state-owned enterprise officials who have tried to engage in bribery related to infrastructure efforts and related to restoration efforts. The anti-corruption system is catching these, investigating them and prosecuting them. So I'm frankly in awe of the fact that they're able to keep doing that. And of course, that's not saying that there isn't a lot of corruption in Ukraine. Of course there is. How couldn't there be? There is legacy corruption, there's wartime corruption, there are many types of corruption that a society struggles from, but the system is there to handle it. And beyond the resilience of the pre-existing system, we're also seeing Ukraine looking at sectors that they hadn't looked at seriously before the war. We have an engagement related, for example, to forestry and timber corruption that was never seriously addressed, but now there is attention to this. And of course, I mentioned before the defense sector and defense manufacturing that was also never quite seriously looked at, but now is quite aggressively being addressed from an anti-corruption perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Juhani. And just to encourage, if you are interested in fighting financial crime in Ukraine, there's no better person to talk to than Oksana, who is wearing two hats, is working with us at CFS at RUSI, but also just established a Center for Financial Integrity in Ukraine and is looking into how to strengthen the financial system in Ukraine and its resilience more systemically. So now we take another round of questions. I can see questions, Oksana, and then the gentleman behind her and the lady here in black.
Yeah, maybe I will start first just to reflect that we have a really vibrant anti-corruption community in Ukraine. And my question would be to Bridget, because I'm really eager to hear what different roles you see for civil society fighting kleptocracy specifically.
Okay, thank you. So that's to Bridget, but before Bridget you will answer, we'll take two more questions.
Hi. Hi, Benjamin Kalitri here with the National Whistleblower Center. It's been great hearing about your research about the response to kleptocracy the past couple years, and I'm definitely going to read the papers that you shared on the board before. I was wondering if you can speak any more about how the incentivization of whistleblowers fits into the, as Bridget phrased it, the network response required to combat network corruption. Thank you.
Thank you. And one more question here.
Hi there. My name is Yeva. I work for Deloitte UK. And as a person who works a lot with sanctions from forensic accounting perspective and wider kind of anti-corruption framework, I hear a lot of complaints about sanctions. Especially from the private sector and just generally in the media and everywhere. And as much as I know that they're not ideal and there's a lot of chaotic process of making the lists, I also do understand that there's Kremlin propaganda which is working day and night to discredit sanctions and basically let out the disinformation about sanctions and just to discredit the sanctions as such. At the same time, sanctions is one of the most powerful non-violent tool. So I just wanted to kind of hear about whether there was any kind of research, obviously there was, but your kind of perspective on the disinformation on sanctions and whether this is something kind of on the radar and kind of distinguish between the actual complaints and something that is being done by the Kremlin.
Okay, so maybe Bridget will turn over to you to respond to questions on the roles of civil society you see through your work with different grantees across the globe in combating kleptocracy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. So I think it might be, to some extent, useful to distinguish of it, because I think most of the discussion here, and in particular looking at the policy responses to modern kleptocracy, have been very much hinged on how to strengthen the democratic allies' response to the illegal aggression of Russia in Ukraine. When we speak with partners in many other countries, while they find this incredibly powerful, there's also often a sense of frustration or disillusionment or the recognition of the challenge that they face in galvanizing anything approaching a similar level of political will to respond to the looting of their assets by their elites. And so really it seems that a question that the global community to some extent is confronting on this specific issue is how to both strengthen the implementation and enforcement of the policy responses to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, while at the same time looking at how can this momentum be, sorry Tom, concretized with regard to other civil society efforts in other regions. And again, just recognizing the extent to which kleptocracy does rely on global financial networks, but often responding to this effectively has relied to some extent on political will in destination countries. There really is an effort to connect activists and investigative journalists from various countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, the Middle East and North Africa, Central Asia, regions that have not perhaps garnered so much attention, to better understand how they can explore not necessarily harnessing this moment, but learning from the experience and the successes in drawing that sort of attention. I think particularly when talking about these tools such as civil forfeiture or beneficial ownership registries or unexplained wealth orders, really you need to strengthen capacity of actors in other regions to understand how they may be able to inform or leverage these tools in their work, but also to provide oversight following the restitution eventually of seized, investigated, and restored assets. The question of whistleblowers is, of course, integral to this. We see in the context of broadly around the word closing civic space, that investigative journalists and affected communities are facing increased security challenges, that there's a real need to better provide holistic, whether that be physical well-being, digital security support to these individuals. And of course, whistleblowers in every way are on the front line in terms of trying to shed more light on specific instances or cases of corruption. It's been heartening to see an increasing efforts by a number of different entities to strengthen legal protections of whistleblowers, but there does still appear to be a bit of a siloing between, in a sense, some of the human rights defender community, the new threats that journalists are facing, including through litigation in destination countries, often by oligarchs or corrupt political elites themselves, and of course the lack of resourcing to adequately protect whistleblowers. So I think our partners do recognize that as sort of an integral element of responding to this challenge, but one that absolutely requires additional resourcing.
Mm-hmm. Tom, do you want to pick up the question on sanctions and comment on sanctions?
I will do, and I'll also tee up Heather, because actually colleague Eliza is writing precisely a paper at the moment on whistleblowing as an output of the SOC-ACE program. But on the sanctions one, look, my personal view is that political leaders have been lazy and have assumed that everyone will just understand sanctions and will realize that they are the right thing to do. And we've obviously got to a stage now where two things are happening. Firstly, as you point out, the Kremlin propaganda machine is very effective at pointing to the damage sanctions are doing to our country, and our economies aren't growing as much, yada, 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 and look at us, we're absolutely fine. I think those claims need to be interrogated in detail. So I think some of the best work on this topic is done by kind of economists who really understand how to read the Russian economy and to actually point to the impact that sanctions are having. So we need to demonstrate that sanctions are actually having an impact on the Russian economy, and therefore any pain that you might feel as a Mittelstand company in Baden-Württemberg in Germany is actually legitimate. The second thing is, of course, that we do, we see a fragmenting across Europe and in certain countries of kind of support for sanctions because people buy into this narrative. Oh, well, they're not working and they're hurting us more than they're hurting them, and so on. So I think we've failed to communicate effectively how the sanctions are working, demonstrate that they are working, present evidence that they are working. And actually, where we determine that they are not working because they were designed at 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning in March 2022, get rid of them, right? Let's be realistic. So I think that this is a challenge ahead for the sanctions community to demonstrate the legitimacy of what they've implemented. There is no doubt that that can be done. It's just it has not been done in an effective way thus far.
And if you want to keep your finger on the pulse and be really up to date on all sorts of issues related on sanctions, please do follow us, our project led by CFS at RUSI called SIFMANET, Sanctions and Illicit Finance Monitoring and Analysis Network. And why I'm saying this is that we produce a sanctions brief that is always full of most recent informations around what's happening in sanctions implementation in the EU, also responses from the policymakers, but also comments from practitioners. So it's something really worth following. Last questions. We can take one more question and then I will have a closing question to all panelists. Do we have any more questions? If not, I have prepared one more question. Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting workshop. I'm Kaita Tambel from Estonia. I'm a researcher. And as Tom at the beginning mentioned, this famous London grad catchword, and the issue of Russian investments in UK was well known long before the war broke up. But how do you estimate, now as the war created this momentum for the UK to change itself, abolishing these golden visa schemes and managing these company house registries, etc. Is the momentum still going on to change, to do something to limit these suspicious investments to the UK? Or what's the situation with the political will and how long we can expect? And actually, perhaps the similar question can ask in terms of Switzerland. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to preface what I say with something that I said yesterday. Then it was about the Financial Action Task Force. Today it's going to be about the UK. So I'm just saying this to go on the record with my friends from the UK government here. The UK government has done a lot in the last 2 years, as you pointed out, around Companies House, the new legislation and so on that's come in. Now, the fruits of that work have yet to materialise. And Heather pointed out this kind of question around lack of investment in enforcement and so on. So I think that there is still a case for the UK to answer. Now, we have the small matter of an election on the 4th of July. If you look at the public statements of, in particular, the current shadow Foreign Secretary, Foreign Minister David Lammy, he suggests that one of his top priorities, as Foreign Secretary, right, one of his top priorities is to combat kleptocracy, for the UK as an international financial centre to show leadership in cleaning up its act, because he recognises, perhaps with some advice from some people on this panel, but he recognises that the UK is still considered part of the problem and needs to demonstrate leadership, become part of the solution. So let's have this conversation again in 6 months' time when we may or may not have had a change of government in the UK, because I think that will be quite an important kind of indicator of commitment. But I think it's fair to say that the UK has worked very hard over the last 2 years. It should have been working hard over the previous 5-10 years. So the last 2 years, you could argue, have been kind of catch up. But now it's kind of caught up with missed legislative opportunities. We should all judge whether that legislation is actually used and put into effective enforcement. On Switzerland.
I guess that
the clues in the title, yes. Basel.
Basel.
Yeah, I suppose. Geographic limitation here. So I think maybe channeling Greta also to some extent, because she's gone on record in her pushy way, challenging Switzerland to do more. I'd imagine that there is an argument being made in Bern that there is a lot more that Switzerland has done than in past situations. That's probably true. But is it in any way enough? Absolutely not. Both in regards to finding Russian assets, but also preventing them from entering Switzerland. So definitely a lot more needs to be done.
I will add one footnote, because again I got a screenshot WhatsApp message from Greta which said words to the effect of "attaboy," because I gave a quote to the Swiss press that said until it proves otherwise, Switzerland will be presumed guilty unless it proves itself innocent. And I think this is an important point, which is that there are a number of jurisdictions that have gathered a reputation. The British Virgin Islands, the UK, Switzerland, take your pick. And frankly, those jurisdictions have had an opportunity over the last couple of years to demonstrate that actually, you know what? Our beneficial ownership registry, which you can't see because it's not as transparent, is genuinely fantastic, because here are all the assets that we've identified that belong to Mr. Abramovich or whatever. And so, for tragic reasons, there is a golden opportunity for places like London, Switzerland, and elsewhere to actually demonstrate that they can stand up in this field when it's necessary. They can confiscate assets, they can return those assets whence they came from, and that sort of thing.
I think it's highly unlikely that there is an attendee that found this discussion boring and took a nap. But if there is such a person, I'm giving you now an opportunity to wake up and take a good note in case someone asks you, what do you think about this panel, this workshop? I'm going to ask a very quick closing question, and I will ask each panelist to answer. And the question is, what one fix would you call for that would reverse the tide of kleptocracy? And I will start with Juhani.
One fix.
And remember, the person that took nap is noting, so take notes.
Challenging. I think the one fix that we need to have is that we need to realize that we are in a different world than we were before, and all the tools that we have need to be upgraded, enhanced, and strengthened. And that means going out of our comfort zone where we were before 2022. Okay,
Heather.
Can I have 30 seconds just to respond to something? On the whistleblower, please. I don't want to. Eliza is wrapping up the research, so I don't want to sort of say too much about it to see what's in the final version. Sign up for our newsletter so that you can see. But also, if you go to the University of Sussex stand, there's a GIACE project by somebody called Dan Haberley, who's been doing fantastic research with leaked data from Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, and it really demonstrates the importance of whistleblowers and leaked data to tackling economic crime, and not forgetting that economic crime is not just about kleptocracy as well, just how important it is. And BBC Africa documentary on, if you look, BBC Africa Senegal $10 billion scandal is such a fabulous documentary about whistleblowers and information and the role of the UK and so on. It's infuriating but great. On the propaganda question, I think it's really important, just to add to what Tom said, to colleagues who work on counter-disinformation stuff will always say, be really clear, disinformation, misinformation, information manipulation, and information operations. And one of the things I think that is most important when it comes to tackling that propaganda is to be really honest about what's true. And we're very bad about being honest about what are some of the true complaints. If we did that, then you can deal with the untrue ones more generally. The one fix to stop This is the sort of question ministers ask you, and you just go. To me, the biggest thing is, and Tom he's going to get so bored with me saying this, but it's the entire system of secrecy jurisdictions and trust and so on, where they may have had a purpose. When you look at the amount of harms that are caused in the world, conflict, weapons, organized crime, child sexual abuse and exploitation, all of these things are facilitated by the same systems that people use for perfectly legal reasons to reduce their tax burden or to protect their assets in divorce or whatever it is. And I really hope our children look back someday and go, wasn't that a crazy time when we allowed a system to be established that enabled these terrible things to happen so a few people could pay less tax and hide their wealth. And I just really think it's that secrecy that we really need to keep focusing on and not maybe get diverted in other ways.
Okay, Bridget?
Unsurprisingly, strengthening capacity, resourcing, empowerment, and networking between civic actors to more effectively respond to the systemic challenges, as well as enhancing protection mechanisms and engagement with private sector, financial sector, and decision makers in source and destination countries.
Tom, surprise us.
I'm going to go back to the work that we referenced with the OCCRP. I remember, as I was an investment banker for 20 years, and I remember nothing made me pay attention to the law more closely than when one of my competitors got whacked by the Department of Justice. And frankly, until we see some enabler heads on spikes and it becomes clear that enabling kleptocracy is not something that you should be doing, I don't think we're going to advance on this. So to me, the enabler issue is something that we need to address. And in the context of that, there are certain countries that clearly should be showing greater leadership on this topic. And those countries should not feel impunity because they are large Western countries that perhaps control the financial system. So, I would like to see, I would like to see the FATF being stronger on the United States. I think there are certain areas where there are big countries in the G7 that need to demonstrate leadership because they're not doing it right now and it's unacceptable.
Many thanks to all of you for your time. This workshop was hosted by Center for Finance and Security. That is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, so please make sure to follow us for more research on everything that is on this intersection of finance and security. Can we please have share the slide with the QR codes once again? Don't forget to take something on board for your flight back home. And Juhani, Heather, Bridget, and Tom, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your insights and comments.